You need to delete those files. Now. Before he sees them. The words, delivered in a hushed, urgent whisper, cut through the stale air of the kitchen. I looked at my mother, her face etched with a fear I'd seen too many times before, a fear directed not at him, but at the potential consequences of his discovery. The soft whir of the refrigerator was the only sound for a long moment, a mundane counterpoint to the seismic shift occurring within me. My life, up until that point, had been a careful negotiation of unspoken rules and simmering resentments, a delicate dance on the edge of a precipice I tried desperately not to acknowledge. We lived in a state of perpetual, low-grade anxiety, where smiles were often forced and silences pregnant with unspoken accusations. He, my stepfather, was a constant, looming presence, his moods dictating the atmosphere of the house like a suffocating fog. My mother, trapped in a cycle of her own making, saw only appeasement as a path forward. My role was to be invisible, a quiet observer in the theater of their strained domesticity. I learned early on that silence was a shield, and compliance a necessary evil. Yet, even in that suffocating normalcy, a tiny ember of defiance had begun to glow, fueled by the slow accumulation of small indignities and outright cruelties. I remembered the time he'd accidentally spilled red wine on my graduation dress, the one I'd saved up for months to buy. His faux apology, accompanied by a glint in his eye that spoke of deliberate malice, had been a masterclass in gaslighting. He'd then proceeded to lecture me for an hour about being careless, his voice a low rumble of judgment. Another time, it was a family vacation. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, a rare chance to escape the oppressive atmosphere of home. On the second day, he'd casually announced that the money he'd set aside for my expenses had been misplaced, and that I'd have to make do. He'd watched my crestfallen face with a flicker of something akin to amusement. My mother had squeezed my arm, a silent plea for me to not make a scene. These weren't isolated incidents. They were brushstrokes on a larger canvas, painting a picture of a man who reveled in control, who thrived on undermining others, and who saw my existence as an inconvenience he tolerated. Each instance chipped away at my spirit, but also, unknowingly, forged a resilience within me. I started to notice patterns, to anticipate his moves, to build mental fortifications against his insidious attempts to diminish me. I documented everything, not with a camera initially, but in a meticulously kept journal, a silent witness to his reign of subtle terror. I learned to read his moods, to gauge his level of threat, and to retreat into my own world whenever he was near. This quiet observation, this internal archiving of his transgressions, became my own form of survival. The day my mother uttered those words, the air was thick with the scent of his aftershave, a cloying aroma that always preceded a storm. I had been upstairs, working on a project, when I heard the raised voices from the living room. It was a familiar soundtrack, but this time, the undertones were different. Sharper. More venomous. I crept down the stairs, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I saw him standing over my mother, his face contorted in a mask of rage, his hands balled into fists. He was accusing her of something, his words a torrent of accusations and threats. Then, his gaze swept across the room and landed on my laptop, which I'd carelessly left open on the coffee table. It was the digital graveyard of his misdeeds, the repository of voicemails, emails, and screenshots I'd meticulously gathered. He knew. Or, he suspected. His eyes narrowed, a predatory gleam igniting them. He lunged for the laptop, his movements jerky and aggressive. My mother, her face ashen, stepped between us. "No, John, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. That's when he turned on her, his voice a low, guttural growl. "If you don't make her delete those files, you'll regret it." The threat hung in the air, palpable and chilling. He shoved her, not hard enough to knock her over, but with enough force to send her stumbling back. My stomach churned. The sheer audacity, the calculated cruelty, the absolute lack of remorse on his face as he looked at my terrified mother, it was the breaking point. My mind, which had been a churning sea of fear and anxiety, suddenly became a calm, still lake. In that moment, something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in a profound, cold clarity. I walked past him, a ghost in my own home. He tried to block my path, his face a mask of disbelief and burgeoning fury. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. I didn't answer. I walked into the kitchen, the scene of my mother's desperate plea. I sat at the table, the cool laminate a stark contrast to the heat radiating from him. My fingers, strangely steady, MOV. Ed across the keyboard. I opened a specific folder, the one containing the encrypted backup. I initiated a transfer protocol, a complex series of commands I'd spent months refining. It wasn't about erasing evidence, it was about redirecting it. It was about ensuring that what he had tried to hide, what he had done, would find its rightful place. My mother appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. He followed her, his jaw clenched, his breathing heavy. He watched my screen, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then, the progress bar appeared, a tiny bar filling with a steady, unwavering blue. His confusion morphed into dawning horror. He lunged for the laptop, but I closed it with a decisive snap, my hand resting on the lid. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as the data flowed, invisibly, irrevocably, to a secure, distant server. His face, for the first time, lost its smug certainty. It was replaced by a flicker of panic, then a slow, creeping realization of his utter impotence. The smugness, the entitlement, the carefully constructed facade of control, it all crumbled in an instant. He looked at me, then at my mother, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape, a reprieve. He had underestimated me. He had always underestimated me. And that, it seemed, was his undoing. The next few days were a blur of frantic energy, but not mine. My phone buzzed incessantly. Texts from his equally avaricious sister, his bewildered former business partners, his disgruntled employees. They were all asking the same questions, receiving the same evasive answers. My mother, initially terrified, slowly began to thaw, her fear replaced by a dawning understanding. He tried to confront me, to bluster and threaten, but I simply met his gaze, my expression unreadable. He realized he had no leverage. The files were out. And they weren't coming back. The social consequences were swift and brutal. His reputation, meticulously crafted over years of manipulation, evaporated like mist in the sun. His business crumbled under the weight of unearthed truths. His social circle, built on a foundation of shared interests and mutual back-scratching, dissolved. He became a pariah, his name whispered with disdain rather than respect. My mother, freed from his oppressive influence, began to breathe again. There were no dramatic pronouncements, no tearful reconciliations. Just a quiet, profound sense of relief that settled over the house like a gentle rain. He was gone, a ghost in the narrative of our lives, his power extinguished not by rage, but by the quiet, unwavering certainty of consequence. The cloud, my cloud, had indeed retaliated. It had held on to what he tried to bury, preserving the truth, and in doing so, had restored a balance that had been so brutally disrupted. The silence that followed was not one of emptiness, but of peace.